Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. On March 20th, 1995, 5 members of the new religious movement Aum Shinrikyo dropped the nerve agent sarin at 5 locations along 3 lines to the Tokyo Metro, then called the Taito Rapid Transit Authority, during rush hour. The perpetrators carried liquid sarin in plastic bags wrapped in newspapers, as well as umbrellas with sharpened tips. Each punctured their bags in designated stations or trains and left passengers, subway employees, and others to suffer the consequences. 5 other members of Aum served as getaway drivers. 14 people died from these attacks, and more than 1,000 others were injured. In the aftermath, the Japanese media whipped public opinion into an anti-Aum frenzy with hundreds of hours of anti-Aum programming on national television. The public response built on long-standing Japanese suspicions about new religions and permanently transformed concern about new religions into characterizations of these movements as cults that kill. New religious movements like Aum have proved to be convenient others in Japanese society ever since. Between the attacks themselves and the lasting cultural impact, in some ways, March 20th, 1995 changed Japan forever. Today, I'm going to argue that the so-called Aum Affair also changed Japanese literature. It created a new kind of disaster for apocalyptic fiction. It created a new other for consideration, and it introduced a new direction of self-reflection in Japanese literature. Our episode today is going to start by defining new religion and taking a closer look at Aum Shinrikyo itself. We'll move on to Haruki Murakami's nonfiction book on the Aum Affair called Underground, the Tokyo Gas Attack and the Japanese Psyche. We'll spend some time on 4 novels that have an acknowledged link to the March 20th attacks, in chronological order by the publication date in the original Japanese. Those are Keiichiro Hirano's Eclipse, Kenzaburo Oe's Somersault, Banana Yoshimoto's The Lake, and Haruki Murakami's Q-Teen84. Then we'll end with a few novels that I'll argue show the continuing influence of the Aum Affair on Japanese fiction. As always, I'm going to try my best to be respectful of living religious traditions as a part of our discussion. A brief content warning before we continue. We will be discussing religions that some people think of as cults. We'll be discussing a terrorist attack that resulted in injury and death. And unless you're skipping spoilers, we'll be talking about fictional cannibalism. The term new religion or new religious movement has been in use since about the 1970s, and it's a pretty loose term. Scholars debate how new a new religious movement needs to be. It's often used for any religion founded in roughly the last 2 centuries. Some scholars only use the term for a religious movement that started after World War II. Most new religions are syncretic. That means they pull ideas and theology and symbolism from multiple older religions. There are new religious offshoots of virtually all world religions: Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, indigenous beliefs, Islam, Judaism, paganism, Sikhism. And the teachings of new religious movements are often, but not always, countercultural. New religious movements are generally also very small. Few have more than 1 million members. It's really important to keep in mind that the term new religious movement or the term new religion isn't supposed to be a judgmental one. New religion is absolutely not a synonym for cult. The bad reputation that new religions have is almost entirely undeserved. The most notorious incident of violence associated with new religious movements is almost certainly the People's Temple in Jonestown, Guyana. In 1978, this new religious movement supervised or led to the deaths of 913 people by murder and suicide. I'm not going to go into detail here, you can look it up, but first I want to be clear that the People's Temple is actually an American church. And second, the events in Jonestown are the origin of the phrase, "don't drink the Kool-Aid." If Jonestown didn't create the link between new religions and cults in many people's minds, it certainly solidified that link. In just a second, I'm going to share a list of new religious movements. You might have really positive associations with some and really negative associations with others. There are some on this list you likely don't think of as new or new religions at all. Sometimes we only remember the religious practices we have neutral or negative feelings about when we use the term new religious movement. The point I'm trying to drive home here is that a new religious movement or new religion isn't necessarily a cult. And the term cult is pretty messy and not really a useful term anyway. So here's a list of religions that qualify under almost all definitions of new religion or new religious movement. Baha'i, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormon, the Church of Satan, esoteric Nazism, Falun Gong, Jediism, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Nation of Islam, Opus Dei, Pentecostalism, Quiverful, Rastafari, the Reformed Druids of North America, the Salvation Army, Scientology, Tolstoyan Primitivism, founded by Leo Tolstoy himself, Unitarian Universalism, and Wicca. Japanese new religions include Happy Science, Reiki, Soka Gakkai, Shinrikyo, and Aum Shinrikyo. Aum Shinrikyo is one of Japan's most notorious new religions, if not decidedly Japan's most notorious new religion. If you trace Aum Shinrikyo theology back to its roots, it evolved from Nichiren Buddhism. We have talked about Nichiren Buddhism before, most notably in our episode about Kenji Miyazawa. Nichiren Buddhism is also the theological foundation of Soka Gakkai, another new religion, and a new religion with theology that contributed to the theology of Aum Shinrikyo. Soka Gakkai is not a syncretic new religion. Its theology derives almost entirely from Nichiren Buddhism. It was founded in 1930, about 50 years before Aum Shinrikyo. Like many new religions, Aum Shinrikyo's founding relied on a single passionate leader. It was founded by a man named Chizuo Matsumoto, who changed his name to Shoko Asahara. Shoko Asahara was born partially blind from congenital glaucoma in 1955. Acupuncture and massage were traditional trades for the blind, so Asahara too trained for these jobs. In 1976, he was convicted of causing bodily injury as an acupuncturist. Following that conviction, he opened a company selling bogus Chinese medicines. He was arrested for it in 1982 when he was in his late 20s. He also joined the new religious group Agon Shu in 1981. Agon Shu evolved from Buddhism with a special emphasis on early Buddhist scriptures called the Agamas. And at its height, some years after Asahara left, the movement had about 580,000 believers. 2 years after Asahara's arrest for his bogus Chinese medicine business, he opened a yoga studio called Aum no Kai, or Aum's Group. his yoga studio also offered religious seminars. And this, in many ways, is the origin of Aum. In 1986, Asahara visited the Himalayas and returned with a revelation to share. Asahara was a prophet, savior of the country, holy pope, and Tokyo's Christ. Asahara would restore the original Buddhism to the world. The Hindu deity Shiva had asked Asahara to lead God's army. Asahara would give rise to a kingdom where the people held psychic powers. Remember that new religions are often syncretic? You can hear here how many theological traditions Asahara is bringing to his new religion. In 1987, this new religion was dubbed Aum Shinrikyo, or Aum Teaching of Truth. This is when Shizuko Matsumoto began to call himself Shoko Asahara. Aum's theology, Asahara's theology, was attractive because it promised its followers enlightenment if they would withdraw from society's pleasures to think about supreme truths. Japan was dominated by materialism. And this was a pretty easy argument to make in 1980s Japan. It would have been a pretty easy argument to make in 1980s America, too. Japan's government and its citizens were evil, according to Asahara. A nuclear Armageddon was coming, following the narrative set out in the Christian book of Revelation. The preparation for Armageddon proved to be the most dangerous element of Aum's theology. Asahara began preparing his followers to take over the government of Japan during the apocalypse. He structured his movement like a government, with himself, of course, as the central leader. Aum Shinrikyo grew rapidly, although it never became as big as some of the competing new religious movements in Japan. It attracted thousands of followers in just a few years. As Aum grew, it gained recognition as a certified religion in 1989. This gave it legitimacy and certain tax privileges. And in 1990, Asahara and several other Aum members tried to gain additional power and legitimacy by running for office in Japan's House of Representatives as the Shinrikyo, or Supreme Truth Party. Asahara lost and vowed revenge against the government. This is more or less when things began to take a sinister turn. As part of its growth, Aum opened a number of businesses. It ran a profitable, legitimate computer business, and Aum also ran an illegitimate trade in illegal drugs, as well as chemical weapons and biological weapons like hydrogen cyanide, anthrax, botulinum toxin, and sarin. These companies were a part of Asahara and Aum's growing openness to terrorist tactics. Over the course of a decade, Aum had grown to include over 10,000 members. Again, not really competitive with some of Japan's biggest new religions, but a pretty impressive support base. Aum also shifted its goal from saving all the people to saving just the chosen few, the members of Aum. All of these developments led to escalating violence. In late 1993 and early 1994, Aum members attempted to use sarin to assassinate the leader of the larger new religion Sakagakkai. They failed another attempted assassination with sarin later in 1994. They successfully killed 8 people with sarin in Matsumoto, Nagano in June 1994, injuring 500 others. They failed to kill a journalist in September using a different toxic gas. Aum also killed up to 20 dissident members using chemical weapons. When Aum members inside Japan's self-defense forces leaked information about a raid on March 22nd, 1995, Asahara ordered the March 20th attack. of what I know about Aum's attack on the Tokyo subway from Haruki Murakami's Underground, the Tokyo gas attack and the Japanese Psyche. It was translated into English by Alfred Birnbaum and Philip Gabriel. Underground is a work of nonfiction, or journalistic literature. It may honestly be my favorite work by Murakami. Murakami published the book in 2 volumes in Japan. It appears in English translation in just 1 volume with 2 parts. Part 1, Underground, includes interviews of victims, or late victims' relatives, describing the events of March 20th, 1995. Part 2, The Place That Was Promised, prevents interviews with former and then current members of Aum. The interviews of victims make the effects of sarin truly visceral. It's much easier to understand the effects of the poison than just reading a list of symptoms on, say, a Wikipedia page. And that's important. The wife of a victim thought media reports, quote, didn't say a thing about how victims died in agony. So what does sarin poisoning look like? Sarin causes a runny nose, chest tightness, and constricting pupils. Your pupils get really small, like you're in a bright light, even if you're inside. Then it leads to worse effects like difficulty breathing, vomiting, and losing control of your bowels. Eventually, someone with sarin poisoning starts having spasms and suffocates to death. The majority of the 1,000 people injured in the attack suffered vision problems, most of them in the short term, but some of them had long-term consequences. One 26-year-old OL struggled to realize she'd been affected by the sarin released at a subway station she passed through on her commute, even though she couldn't really see by the time she got to work. She said, I raised quite a fuss at the office. It was so painful. I just couldn't work. Strange, I thought. How can everything be so dark with the lights on? It was darker than if I'd been wearing sunglasses. The story of her search for medical care is honestly heartbreaking. No one had time or expertise to help someone with a minor injury like significantly impaired vision. So many of the victims were afraid to inconvenience others by seeking help. One man described going to work after the attack as though nothing had happened. Eventually, his wife talked him into going to the hospital. The hospital immediately diagnosed him with sarin poisoning and put him on an IV drip of the antidote. He called the office to say, I have to be hospitalized for I don't know how many days. Sorry to trouble you, but could you tidy up my desk? He spent 6 days in the hospital. It's also worth noting how many of the interviewed victims express some sympathy for what might attract someone to an organization like Aum. One said, maybe it sounds strange, but it's not like I don't understand all this religious fanatic stuff. I've always had a feel for that side of things. And another one added, with society the way it is, everyone just chasing after money, I can sort of understand how young people might be attracted to something more spiritual, like religion. Not that I am myself. The interviews of Aum members in Part 2 are also fascinating. Aum members describe how different they felt, how isolated before they became members. No matter where I found myself, I felt like there was a hole inside me. With the wind rushing through, I never felt satisfied. There always seemed to be a wall separating me from the rest of the world. I don't have any special skills. Nothing makes me stand out from the crowd. I don't even feel like I want to get married. Now, if you read much Japanese fiction, you may notice that these lines could easily come from the characters in many contemporary Japanese novels. You'll definitely find lines like these in most of the work of Sayaka Murata, maybe even in some of Banana Yoshimoto's novels. And these are both authors we'll discuss later in the episode. Without excusing the attacks, Haruki Murakami ultimately does sympathize with the people attracted to Aum who, quote, couldn't help having grave doubts about the inhumane, utilitarian gristmill of capitalism and the social system in which their own essence and efforts, even their own reasons for being, would be fruitlessly ground down. Murakami's essay closing part 1 is some of my favorite writing by Murakami. It's profound and thoughtful. He suggests that the polemic put forth by the media after the Aum Affair was quite straightforward in structure. To them, the moral principle at stake in the gas attack was all too clear. Good versus evil, sanity versus madness, health versus disease. It was an obvious exercise in opposites. Murakami wants to offer an alternative. The us versus them vocabulary has been done to death. Instead, the Aum phenomenon disturbs precisely because it is not someone else's affair. It shows the Japanese a distorted image of themselves in a manner none of them could have foreseen. The narrative that most Japanese embrace or imagine they share broke down. None of those common values proved the least effective in warding off the evil violence that erupted under them. Aum's founder, Shoko Asahara, was, in a limited sense, a master storyteller who offered the members of Aum an alternative narrative. Can Japanese culture, or even storytellers like Murakami himself, offer something better? Before we move on to fictional accounts that have been affected or driven or motivated by the Aum Affair, allow me to close the loop on the Aum Affair itself. Shoko Asahara was convicted of murder for his role in the attacks on the Tokyo subway. He was sentenced to death in February 2004 and executed in 2018, along with several members who carried the attacks out. In 2019, a man drove a car into a crowd of pedestrians in Tokyo in retaliation for the death penalty, probably referring to Asahara's execution. That was the last act of violence attributed to one of Asahara's followers. Aum ostensibly still exists. It renamed itself Aleph in early 2000. The character Aleph has been used in some religious traditions to represent the oneness of God. A splinter group, Hikari no Wa, or the Circle of Rainbow Light, still exists with a tiny number of followers. Several countries continue to regard both Aum Aleph and Hikari no Wa as terrorist organizations. The U.S. State Department removed Aum from a terrorist organization watch list in 2022 because it is largely defunct. We're going to turn now to a few Japanese novels written after 1995. The first four, Eclipse, Somersault, The Lake, and Q-Teen84, are direct responses to the events of 95. The second, more recent set, There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job, Earthlings, and Trinity, all explore new religion as a sinister, but very understandable, way to cope with alienation in modern Japanese society. These are novels for which I think the Aum Affair provides important context. There will be some spoilers as a part of our episode. You may know that I don't think spoilers ruin most stories. I do know that's a minority opinion, so I will be giving warnings to skip ahead. 1998's Eclipse is probably the earliest work of literary fiction in English translation that's a direct reply to the Aum attacks. But the author, Keiichiro Hirano, was also responding to a broader crisis of meaning in Japan. 1995 was a pretty awful year for the Japanese. In fact, translator Ted Goosen thought 1995 kicked off an entirely new era of Japanese apocalyptic fiction. While the economic bubble burst in 1989, some scholars regard 1995 as the year in which Japan began to seriously suffer from that economic collapse. On January 17, 1995, a 6.9 magnitude earthquake struck the southern part of Hyogo Prefecture in south-central Honshu, Japan's main island. In Japan, this earthquake is known as the Great Hanshin Earthquake. Outside of Japan, we usually call it the Kobe earthquake, after the largest major city it affected. The quake killed more than 6,000 people. 4,600 of them were in Kobe. It also injured 44,000 people and caused about 10 trillion yen in damage. Then the Aum attacks took place just 2 months later. Combined, these three events shook Japan's confidence. Japan had gone from being number one to being a country devastated by an economic crisis, an earthquake, and a terrorist attack. The events perhaps even caused that crisis of meaning or a crisis of identity. Keiichiro Hirano was born in 1975, so he was a young man on the cusp of adulthood as these events were taking place. Some people call the 1990s Japan's lost decade, and people who are Hirano's age the lost generation. These men and women graduated from high school or college into what has become known as the employment ice age, a period of low employment and frozen hiring that lasted from about 1994 to about 2004. Some of the youngest men and women in Aum would have been his contemporaries. Hirano started writing Eclipse, which is his first novel, when he was just 20 years old. He published it when he was 21. If I were to summarize Eclipse in one sentence, this is how I'd do it. Eclipse is the fictional memoir of a late medieval Dominican friar named Nicholas who sets out to study pre-Christian philosophy and learns a lot more than he bargained for. It is a gorgeous, twisting, philosophical novel that it's difficult to analyze without spoiling. And remember, I'm a person who doesn't really believe in spoilers, so this is a novel I consider kind of special. Eclipse is relevant for our purposes today because it takes up questions of belief, mass delusion and mass hysteria, orthodoxy and heterodoxy or heresy, and whether great spiritual leaders are dangerous. One notable allegory in the novel is an extended witch hunt of sorts led by a Dominican inquisitor, not Nicholas. Hirano commented, "When the values essential to sustain a community are significantly shaken, we work to maintain our group identity by treating some heterogeneous, or different than us, elements as evil and trying to oppose and exclude them. Rather than come face to face with each other, which forces us to acknowledge our conflicting values and may cause rupture, we fixate on one thing antagonistically and thereby distract ourselves from the differences between us and our neighbors." You may hear echoes of Murakami's essay from Underground here, a concern that fixating on an other or something outside of ourselves and our society prevents introspection and moving forward. Keiichiro Hirano also set his novel in the late Middle Ages, in 1482, because he thought of those years as a time of cultural decay. 1990s Japan, too, needed a new cultural center. When Hirano approached writing this novel, he has said he no longer knew how he ought to live in this world. His desire to live was agonizingly intense, and yet he had lost all sight of the future. He wanted Eclipse to become for readers a space of mystical experience that transcends the oppressive weight of life. So here's a guy in his early 20s seeing the events of 1995, seeing the Aum Affair, and writing a book about finding meaning in a moment of cultural crisis. I think this is amazing. If you want a deeper dive into Keiichiro Hirano and Eclipse, check out Read Japanese Literature episode 42. I even got a chance to interview the author for that episode. Kenzaburo Oe's Somersault was published just a year later in 1999. It's a more direct and, frankly, less creative response to Aum and the Aum Affair. It was Oe's first published novel after winning the Nobel Prize in 1994. It was translated into English by Philip Gabriel in 2003. Full disclosure, Somersault was the only novel I needed to read for the first time for this episode, and allow me to say I was not impressed with this book, y'all. And as a side note, Haruki Murakami deserves criticism for the way he portrays women, and boy does he earn some of that criticism for Q-teen-84, which we'll discuss in just a minute. But also, Murakami is singled out in English because so few English readers read fiction by other Japanese men. This novel opens with a little boy shoving a Lego model in a dancing girl's vagina. These two characters grow up to play major roles in the book. The boy gets a name, Kikuo, but the girl remains just Dancer. And she is also the least realized and only female major character in the book. There's a character in the novel who is just the dark-skinned reporter, whose skin reminds one of the major characters of a tengu, and the depiction of two gay characters is so heavily stereotyped it likely qualifies as homophobic. Anyway, Somersault is about a new religion that broke down a decade before the novel opens, when its two charismatic leaders, Savior and Prophet, did a somersault, renouncing their teachings and their most radical followers. If they hadn't renounced their most radical followers, those followers had planned to occupy a nuclear power plant and turn it into a stationary nuclear bomb. Now, with a cast of characters including Kikuo, Dancer, an innocent youth, and an older art professor dying of cancer, the two leaders want to form a new religious movement. And the two leaders now call themselves Patron and Guide, instead of Savior and Prophet. Essentially, the teaching of the original Church of the Savior and the Prophet was this. The Savior, now known as Patron, had visions that told him the world was coming to an end. He, quote, wanted the people who live on this planet to have the courage to face that crisis while they still had the energy to be restored to life out of the ruins. The radical faction wanted to force the world to end right now. Patron's new movement is explicitly not Aum. In fact, the characters are at pains at several points in the novel to draw distinctions between Aum and their own movement. The dark-skinned reporter points out the coincidence of Patron's timing. Why now, after Aum Shinrikyo, has Patron returned? A former member of the radical faction explains, one clear difference between us and Aum was that those participating in the operation did not intend to survive. We put our own lives on the line. I, for one, do not find this particularly reassuring, but Somersault finally crawls toward an interesting climax, some 520 pages into its 570-page girth. And yes, the climax is climactic. It takes up questions about violence and death and sacrifice as part of religious experience, especially in new religious movements. And it also highlights how important, or not, the role of a charismatic leader really is for a movement like the one founded by Patron and Guide. The epilogue leaves the reader with the possibility that this church may move forward as a post-insurrection millennial reign of repentance that is, quote, clearly different from the Aum concept of a self-centered Armageddon. After all, having an insurrection lead straight to the end of the world, to nothing but death, was a defeatist attitude. The novel closes with the line, "For us, a church is a place where deeds of the soul are done." Before we turn to Banana Yoshimoto's The Lake, I'd like to quickly note that The Lake is not the first time Yoshimoto takes up new religions. If you'd like to do an interesting cultural comparison, pick up a copy of the short story collection Lizard, translated by Anne Sheriff, and flip to the story Blood and Water. Lizard and the stories in it was published in Japan in 1993, 2 years before the Aum Affair. The protagonist of Blood and Water still wants to escape the new religion she was born into in the story, but that new religion is more or less benign. Blood and Water contains the only benign depiction of a new religion I know of in contemporary Japanese fiction. And again, it was written before the Aum Affair. A more or less benign new religion is not what we'll see in The Lake. The Lake was published in Japan in 2005 and translated into English by Michael Emmerich in 2011. In some ways, The Lake is much like Banana Yoshimoto's other work. There's cooking, art, complicated maternal relationships, almost fraternal romance, a hint of the supernatural. The protagonist is a grieving young woman, Chihiro, and the novel is loosely organized around a hesitant romantic relationship with a young man named Nakajima. As Chihiro and Nakajima grow closer to each other, Chihiro begins to learn more about his backstory. At the beginning of their relationship, all she knows about his past is that he has been through something terrible. Eventually, the pair visit Nakajima's closest friends who live near a scenic lake, a brother and sister named Mino and Chi, whom Nakajima has known since childhood. Chi is bedridden and has psychic powers. Mino, her brother, acts as her mouthpiece. Mino tells Chihiro that he and Chi are like ghosts, that even though they're not supposed to exist, they're alive. In some ways, just including the lake in this episode has spoiled the surprise element here. Still, this is where you can skip forward about 3 minutes if you don't want any more spoilers. Nakajima and his friends grew up in a bizarre religious cult. Near the end of the novel, Chihiro realizes she had seen Mino and Chi's mother on TV when Chihiro was in elementary school. Their mother was notorious. People knew her as a terrible mother. She had joined a group that had done horrible things, and she had taken her children with her. Chihiro had seen Nakajima's mother too. If Mino and Chi's mother was presented as an incarnation of evil, Nakajima's mother was the incarnation of everything good. Things are never that simple, and Chihiro doesn't see why it had to be presented that way. Apparently, Nakajima had attended a summer camp in Izu for gifted children. One evening, he just didn't come home. He was just one of many people who had been kidnapped. According to Chihiro, shortly after that, the group began turning up in the news. It wasn't quite a religion. Their goal was to live in accordance with certain principles to create a new ideal humanity. Naturally, there was a sort of leader, and people gathered to listen to him preach, and then they established a commune deep in the mountains that was very nearly self-sufficient. It disbanded, or at least shrank dramatically, after the kidnappings came to light. The incident left an impression on Chihiro as a small child, but not a strong one. It had gotten all mixed up in her mind with other similar stories. Chihiro learns all this not from Nakajima, her boyfriend, but from Mino. When Nakajima finally brings himself to discuss what happened with Chihiro, his words are powerful. I get the sense that most people assume that when someone who's been brainwashed comes out of it, there's a feeling of relief. That it's like waking up. But it isn't like that. You feel sort of dull. Nothing is clear. It makes you miserable. That's the truth. I felt like there was nothing good waiting for me. Haruki Murakami published Q-teen 84 in 3 volumes. Volumes 1 and 2 debuted in Japan in 2009. Volume 3 debuted in 2010. J. Rubin translated Volumes 1 and 2. Philip Gabriel translated Volume 3. All 3 volumes appeared in English in 2011. For what it's worth, Volumes 1 and 2 are often regarded as an exciting and thoughtful adventure story with one of Murakami's strongest female protagonists. Although Volume 2 does also involve the male protagonist having sex with a teenage girl, resulting in the strong female protagonist's mystical pregnancy, this is the kind of problematic way Murakami writes women in Q-teen 84. Almost everyone thinks Volume 3 really drags and finds it a disappointment. Like Somersault, Q-teen 84 takes on Aum more or less directly. Here, Aum becomes Sakigake, a religion that varies from Aum in several important ways. Still, both rely on a single charismatic guru, and both are willing to use violence to achieve their aims. Notably, Aum was founded in 1984. Q-teen 84's protagonist is named Aumame. She grew up in the Society of Witnesses, pretty transparently based on Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses are an offshoot of Christianity that qualifies as a new religion by most definitions. Aumame strongly opposes people she calls religious fundamentalists. She says their intolerant worldview, their inflated sense of their own superiority, and their callous imposition of their own beliefs on others fills her with an almost uncontrollable rage. The novel itself has a more considered approach to religion. Murakami is consistently hesitant to write good guys and bad guys in his fiction. Remember that if Underground isn't necessarily sympathetic to the Aum attackers, it's certainly sympathetic to the kinds of people who were drawn to Aum in the first place. Murakami has the leader of Sakigake reflect to Aumame, most people are not looking for provable truths. What people need is beautiful, comforting stories that make them feel as if their lives have some meaning, which is where religion comes from. In many, many ways, Q-teen 84 is a direct realization of the sort of ideas Murakami considers in Underground, especially in the essay that closes part 1. In this last section of today's episode, we're going to turn to a more recent set of stories. There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job, Earthlings, and Trinity, Trinity, Trinity. I'm going to suggest to you that all three explore new religions as a sinister, but very understandable, way to cope with alienation or other problems in modern Japanese society. Akutagawa-winning author Kikuo Tsumura published There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job in Japan in 2015. It was translated into English by Polly Barton in 2020. There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job is about a young woman who has burnt herself out through overwork in a beloved first career. It has sucked up, quote, every scrap of energy the protagonist has. In this episodic novel, the protagonist asks a recruiter to help her find an easy job. Something along the lines of sitting all day in a chair overseeing the extraction of collagen for use in skincare products. The recruiter places her in 4 different temporary jobs. It's the third placement I'd like to examine in detail, and the task is called the postering job. There are some spoilers here, but we're only talking about a quarter of the novel with 4 distinct episodes, and I don't think this discussion is going to significantly reduce your enjoyment of the book. The novel's heroine finds herself tasked with asking people to put public service announcements in front windows of their homes. This sounds like an easy job. The signs say things like, check behind you when turning corners, make our town greener, water belongs to everyone. While she's doing this easy job, the protagonist finds other posters in people's front windows, and they read, Lonely No More. She learns that Lonely No More is a group that is aggressively recruiting in the neighborhood. One neighbor tells the novel's protagonists they don't give up. It's not a job with them, see? It's a dogma. Eventually, our heroine decides to investigate Lonely No More by attending one of their meetings. She realizes people are likely to be tempted by what Lonely No More is offering. To believe that such tactics wouldn't work was overly optimistic. In reality, when issued an invitation by a good-looking youngster who was sympathetic to their predicament, there were a lot of people who would fall for it. Why did this novel make me think of the Aum Affair? Why did it make me think that the Aum Affair colored the way Tsumura wrote this scene? For one, there are other religious organizations active in Japan that might do door-to-door recruiting or evangelization, even religions that aren't so new. Still, Aum has colored the public perception of religious recruiting, maybe indelibly. Much like Aum, Lonely No More is actively exploiting community members' feelings of alienation or their fear they can't participate in normal social behavior. Like Aum, Lonely No More uses people who are young and attractive as its public face. In the end, the narrator helps her employer drive Lonely No More out of the neighborhood. It's a win, sort of, but the employer too disappears. The somewhat sinister, new religion-esque organization is gone, but no one addresses the loneliness that sent people to Lonely No More's meetings in the first place. Sayaka Murata published Earthlings in 2018, after she had already won the Akutagawa Prize for Convenience Store Woman. It was also translated into English in 2020 by Murata's long-standing translator, Jenny Topley Takamori. It might be a bit of a stretch to find a relationship to the Aum Affair or new religious movements in this one. Murata is deeply interested in alienation and difference, themes that you could say overlap with Aum more than derive from an interest in the Aum Affair itself. Still, I think the particular events of Earthlings take on a special significance if you read the novel through a post-Aum lens. Whenever I mention Earthlings, I do add that it's a novel that comes with all the content warnings. Do not be fooled by the hedgehog on the cover or by how much you enjoyed Convenience Store Woman. Earthlings is a dark, dark story. The protagonist is a woman named Natsuki, although we first encounter her not as a woman, but as a little girl. As an adult, Natsuki is acutely aware of her status in a late-stage capitalist state. She's a tool for the town's good, who must study hard to become a good work tool and be a good girl so that she can become a reproductive organ for the town. Eventually, Natsuki meets an equally alienated man, Tomoya. They marry just to avoid scrutiny. Now she won't have to have sex with him or be a reproductive organ after all. They also reunite with Natsuki's cousin and childhood friend, Yu. And the three decide together that they actually aren't weird. They're just from another world. And I'll do my best here to pronounce the world they're from. I've always been afraid I pronounce it wrong. They're from another world called Popinpobopia. If you're worried about spoilers, this is where I suggest you skip forward 2 minutes. Natsuki, Tomoya, and Yu decide to leave society behind and live as Popinpobopians. There are certainly other ways to read what living as a Popinpobopian entails, but you can easily read it as forming a new religion of just 3 people. 3 alienated people who reject the cultural norms that oppress them and decide to live by their own set of rules. Within months, these 3 people living by their own set of rules have carried out murder to protect themselves. And then they have cannibalized the corpse to keep themselves fed. When that meat is gone, they begin cannibalizing each other in a stomach-turning orgy of consuming and being consumed. If being a Popinpobopian is indeed to be a member of a new religious movement, this is perhaps a sinister representation. It's worth keeping in mind that Sayaka Murata is never an author to shy away from the notion that the rules that govern the way we live need to be re-examined. So alternatively, it's possible the ick factor here is not supposed to be ick at all. That's just the way Sayaka Murata is. Erika Kobayashi published Trinity, Trinity, Trinity in Japan in 2019. It was translated into English by Brian Bergstrom in 2022. The novel is organized around a single day, the opening ceremony of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, a date still in the future when the book was originally published in the fall of 2019, a day that we now know didn't actually occur. Like Yu Mary's Tokyo Ueno Station, Trinity, Trinity, Trinity also considers the intersection of the 3/11 triple disasters, the failure of the government's response to the triple disasters, and the 2020 Olympics. Trinity, Trinity, Trinity is written in the voice of an unnamed female narrator caring for both her elderly mother and her teenage daughter. But it also includes an enormous and convoluted series of flashbacks. All of Kobayashi's work in English considers the question of radioactivity in Japan and in the world. So Trinity, Trinity, Trinity connects the discovery of uranitite with Marie Curie, the Nazis, the development of the atomic bomb, the 3/11 triple disasters. The new religion-esque element in the novel is Trinity. Trinity is a disease that has begun to strike Japan's elderly, including the narrator's mother. It resembles dementia, but as sufferers lose their own memories, their memories are gradually replaced with the memories of radiation itself. They're essentially possessed by radiation. Kobayashi is fairly explicit about her use of memory loss as a metaphor for Japan's collective amnesia about nuclear disasters. Trinity is the novel's term for disease sufferers. In the words of one Trinity, it's not me who suffers from true memory loss. It's all of you. You who fail to remember the past. You who cannot feel even the tiniest bit of the pain of that which cannot be seen. Notably, at least one Trinity carries out a major terrorist attack. They distribute 235 million yen that's contaminated with radiation. 235 million yen was the amount of money the Diet approved to develop nuclear power capabilities after the end of World War II. According to the novel, 235 million yen was chosen by the Diet to correspond to the isotope uranium-235 used in the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So unlike There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job and Earthlings, Trinity, Trinity, Trinity doesn't present new religion or a new religion-esque entity. as something that addresses isolation in 2010's Japan. But like the two other post-Aum novels, it does present a new set of beliefs that addresses a very real problem in contemporary Japan that isn't really being addressed in any other way. I suppose I can't really end with the question, why should we read books about Aum Shinrikyo? Because almost none of the books we've talked about today are about Aum Shinrikyo. The question is maybe more like, how can learning a nation's history and culture make our reading of translated literature richer? Because that's what the question we've been considering all day really is. Has the Aum Affair truly changed some contemporary Japanese fiction? If you've been listening for a while, you likely know that I tend to read with a Marxist lens. That means not that I read as a communist, but as someone who acknowledges that history and culture are irrevocably a part of the way books are written and the way we read. The British literary critic Terry Eagleton wrote a famous study, Marxism and Literary Criticism, in 1976. In that book, he explained that the aim of Marxist criticism is to explain the literary work more fully, and this means a sensitive attention to its forms, styles, and meanings, but it also means grasping those forms, styles, and meanings as the product of a particular history. Actually, the same kinds of ideas came up in our last episode about Yasunari Kawabata. Denying that art has political content is part of a fascist aesthetic. But this isn't a theory-focused podcast, and I don't want to go too far afield. The main point is that I didn't start looking for these common links in a diverse set of stories before I learned about the Aum Affair. Learning about the Aum Affair, reading underground, enriched my reading of novels like Q-teen84, where that link is obvious. It enriched my reading of Blood and Water, when I could consider, why is this short story and its portrayal of new religions so different than anything else I've ever read from Japanese? And it led me to think about why new religions, or things that sort of look like new religions, might seem sinister in Japanese fiction written after 1995. Today we've looked at several novels. You can find a full list on the episode page. North Americans can buy their books through our bookshop to support the podcast. The best way to support Read Japanese Literature is through our Patreon at patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. A big thank you to RJL's newest supporters, and a big thank you to all Read Japanese Literature's Patreon supporters who have contributed ideas and feedback about next season. This episode is the end of season 5. I'll be taking a summer hiatus. My kids are out of school, and also it is too damn hot to continue recording in my attic without running the noisy air conditioner. I am recording at the moment at 10 p.m. I'll see you again in August with planned episodes on Japanese horror, especially Ryu Murakami, Japanese comfort novels, love suicides in literature, and Junichiro Tanizaki. I look forward to reading together with you then. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. Reach us through Patreon, through the website readjapaneseliterature.com, through Blue Sky at readjapaneseliterature.com, or through YouTube /@readjapaneseliterature. Thank you to the Japanese literature communities on Blue Sky and Goodreads, and thank you as always to producer Keim for today's music, KHAIMmusic.com.